Hi again, students. Welcome back to Economics Simplified with Favor. If you are new here, I am Favor, as in God's favor. Please do me a favor, and I remain your instructor for this class, Introduction to Microeconomics, as in MICRO. So do not forget to like, to share, and to subscribe, okay? Tell your friends who are taking economics classes all about these videos, and I'm sure they will find it useful because I've gotten a lot of good feedback from other students on how much they find these videos useful. And I'm using the textbook Principles of Microeconomics by Gregory Mankiw, either the 9th or the 10th edition, and I simply break down complex economic topics into simple concepts and explanations that everyone can understand and relate it to real life examples. So today, very quickly, we're going to be covering chapter 18, which is on oligopoly. So we already talked about this in the previous chapter, but I'm going to go into more depth of how few sellers can collaborate in order to still gain and retain their market power. As you know, oligopoly involves few sellers, okay? So maybe 4 or 5 sellers thereabouts, right? Rather than competing against each other, it's in their best interest to come together and work together, act as one big monopolist. That means they collude in order to retain their market power. Or they could act as a cartel. So cartel means that once they agree on a decision, everybody works towards that decision, but as individual firms, right? Now, how much market power that oligopolistic firms have is determined by their market concentration ratio. So in other words, how much of the market do they have within their reach? Most times, oligopolistic firms have about 50% control of the market, so like about 50% of the population patronize their goods and services. A very good example would be streaming services such as Netflix, cable TV, Amazon Prime, Hulu, Disney Plus, HBO Max. All of those streaming services captures about approximately 50% or slightly more of the total population in that country, right? You could also have like stronger oligopolies that control about 90% of the market. Most of the time, this includes transportation services, like I already mentioned, the airlines, right? Delta Airlines, Southwest Airlines, United Airlines, American Airlines, like those few airlines, you don't have a choice. Either you're going for one or the other, right? And most of the time, these airlines, because usually work together, most of their decisions align. You won't find an airline making a decision that would counteract another airline, right? So most of them, for instance, engage in price discrimination, where you have different prices for different consumers based on their willingness to pay, and they offer different services as an incentive, right? So they are in agreement of these things. Another example would be like express delivery services, which I mentioned in the last chapter as well. You have like FedEx, you have United Postal Services, you have United States Postal Services, USPS, you have DHL, right? So these are like few delivery services that dominate the market because you either use one or the other based on, again, the quantity of how much you want to ship or the price. We talked about cigarettes, and we also talked about car rentals, right? So there are only few car rental services you could go to, or like few stores that actually sell cigarettes. We know that it is in the best interest of oligopolies to either collude as one monopolist or operate as a cartel, where they are still individual but still have similar practices. But do they always cooperate? No. In reality, they don't always work together because of selfish interest, right? So in some instances, if one person deviates from the common agreement, then they might stand to benefit more than if they cooperated. First of all, there are certain concepts I want you to understand. The first concept is what we call a Nash Equilibrium. So a Nash Equilibrium is simply when individual firms choose production quantity or price that works best for them, right? In other words, they are choosing a quantity that is greater than the monopoly quantity, so they are not going to restrict quantity so much, but less than the competitive quantity. So they are trying to find a middle ground between increasing quantity above the monopoly level, but also not producing so much quantity as in perfect competition. And at the same time, they're also trying to find a middle ground between selling at the greater than the perfect competitive price, but still less than the monopoly price. So they don't want the price to be too high, but at the same time, they don't want the price to be too low. Now let's take an example. There's something called prisoner's dilemma, which is something that we often use in economics. But basically what that means is that 2 criminals, for instance, are caught by the police, and they have 4 options available to them. The first option is that both of them confess and they get, let's say, 10 years in prison. So reduced sentence. Maybe they were meant to spend 20 years in prison, but then end up getting 10 years in prison each if both of them confess. The next option is that both of them do not confess, right? Both of them deny, and then they get released if there's no like physical evidence to hold them or charge them to jail. The next option that could happen is that if they agree, okay, I'm not going to confess, right? But then one person decides to snitch and tell on the other person, then whosoever decides to snitch is going to get some incentive of maybe less jail time or even goes scot-free, or sometimes the government even uses whosoever snitches as an informant to help the police in the future. But whosoever is caught unawares by the snitching partner ends up getting more jail time. So if your partner snitches on you and gets a free time, then you who were being snitched on would end up getting like 25 years, 30 years in prison, or even life imprisonment if you're not careful, right? That's a dilemma for most prisoners. So the ideal thing would be for both of you not to confess, but you don't know the amount of evidence that they have against you, and you don't know how much maybe they would use someone's family or something to threaten the other person to confess, right? So not confessing is a very great risk. So because of that, the Nash equilibrium that would be better for both parties is just to confess. Take your 10 years and go, right? So the Nash equilibrium in this case is that both of them should confess. Now there's also something called a dominant strategy. So a dominant strategy is you make your individual decision regardless of what other firms choose. You don't care what other firms are doing, they're just making your own selfish decision. And a good example of that is, so let's say political parties. So every country has a few political parties which counts as oligopoly. So for instance, in the United States we have Republican political party, we have Democratic political party, and these two political parties could either decide to work together or work against each other. But in most situations, if they decide to work together, then the people would see them as weak. Like, why is this party sucking up to this party? Nobody wants to be perceived as weak. Another example is the government, right? So governments could decide to disarm military missiles for the safety of the citizens, but at the same time, no government wants to suck up to the other government and appear to be weak, right? So these are a few examples of oligopoly where the dominant strategy is not to work together, but to work against each other. So for instance, that's why you see during political campaigns, every political party has a choice of not saying bad things about the other political party, but that's not what we see in real life. In real life, you see each political party is running a negative campaign ad against the other political party, bad-mouthing the other political party, saying lies about the other political party just to get votes, or they would bash the other government or to be perceived more favorably by the citizens. So in that case, the dominant strategy would be not to cooperate. Let's take another example. Assuming you have two fishing companies. The two fishing companies could cooperate to reduce the quantity of fishes being sold, and that would in turn drive up the price. So remember, scarcity is to increase price. And if they do that, they stand to make a profit of $300 million each. That's a lot of profit, right? On the other hand, if they cooperate to not reduce the quantity, let's say they are very nice people, they just want to sell as much as possible. So they flood the market with more quantities of fishes to sell in the market, then that would reduce their profit to $250 million each. If one person decides to snitch on the other company, let's say they agree, okay, we're going to produce small quantity, and then one person decides to go produce a large quantity, whosoever the snitch is would stand to get a higher amount of profit, right, than the person who was sidetracked. So in this case, the best option is to collude and reduce the limited quantity so that they make $300 million profits. The Nash equilibrium, however, the safer option is just sell as much quantity as possible and make $250 million profits. That's a win-win. Like, it's still better than nothing, right? So satisfy the consumers with as much quantity and still make your profits. All right, so that would be the Nash equilibrium. The dominant strategy might be to cheat on the other company, and so in that case, whoever decides to break away from the agreement would end up having as much as, let's say, $400 million profit as opposed to just $300 million, right? And then whoever was sidetracked from the cheating company would end up making just maybe $100 million profit, right? So this is how the Nash equilibrium, the dominant strategy, work together in terms of collusion decisions of oligopolists. That is pretty much that for chapter 18. I hope you have found this video helpful once again. Don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe. Okay, share the good news of these economics videos with your friends who might find it useful, and see you in the next chapter.